I remember the moment as if it had been etched into my bones, the way Aunt Vivian's gaze settled on me, sharp and unyielding, as though she could see every corner of my soul and decide whether it deserved mercy. I had come to her house that afternoon thinking it would be a normal visit, just a quick hello before retreating back to the safety of my small, predictable life. But the second I stepped through her front door, the air itself seemed to change, thickening, almost pressing against my chest. Her smile was sweet, but there was a steel hidden behind it, a promise I couldn't yet understand. "I've been thinking about you," she said, and the words were simple, almost affectionate, but the way they landed in my ears made my stomach twist. She gestured to the chair beside her, velvet and high-backed, regal in its own right. "You're growing up so fast, but there's so much you still need to learn about refinement, about poised about yourself." I laughed nervously, trying to hide the sudden pulse of anxiety. I think I'm doing okay," I murmured, unsure why my voice sounded small even to me. Her eyes glimmered. "Oh, darling, we'll see about that. I have some ideas. I think it's time you really understood what it means to carry yourself." Before I could respond, she leaned closer, and the faint scent of lavender and silk surrounded me. "It's about learning to serve with elegance, to be seen, not just as yourself, but as someone refined." Her words were gentle, but the weight behind them made my heart stutter. I didn't understand yet, but some deep part of me felt a pulse of fear and curiosity all at once, an unsettling mixture that made my skin tingle. She stood, brushing invisible dust from her hands, and I noticed for the first time the wardrobe at the corner of the room, tall, polished, and utterly imposing. The doors seemed almost alive, whispering promises of transformation. "You'll start tomorrow," she said softly, almost kindly, but the tone had an edge. "We'll begin with something simple: clothing, posture, mannerisms. You'll find it's not just about how the world sees you, but how you see yourself." I swallowed hard, trying to force a normal laugh, but it caught in my throat. My mind raced, imagining what she meant. The idea of change, of being molded, guided, reshaped, was both terrifying and strangely magnetic. I couldn't pull my eyes away from the wardrobe, couldn't stop thinking about the soft swish of satin and lace that seemed to call to me from inside. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the pivot, the day my reflection would begin to shift in ways I could never unsee, never unfeel. Aunt Vivian had opened the door, and I had stepped, willingly or not, into a world where the rules were hers, and my old self would have to learn to bend, shimmer, and adapt. As I left her house that evening, the memory of her gaze burned behind my eyes. The city outside felt unreal, a blur of lights and shadows. And somewhere, deep inside, a new part of me was already stirring, trembling, and waiting for the day it would have to stand in satin and lace. Morning arrived in uneasy silence, the kind that presses down on you, making the smallest tasks feel monumental. I could hear my own heartbeat, drumming loud in my ears, as if it, too, was aware of the day's weight. Aunt Vivian's house was a short walk from the bus stop, but my steps felt heavy, uncertain, as though each one carried me closer to a self I wasn't sure I wanted to meet. The moment I arrived, she was waiting, her posture immaculate, the faint glint of a brooch catching the morning light. "Good," she said, voice smooth and precise. "You're punctual. That's the first lesson." She led me to the room with the wardrobe, the one I had stared at the day before, half in fear, half in fascination. The doors loomed taller than me, polished to a reflective shine that made my heart twist. "Before we begin, you need to understand something," she said, turning to face me, her eyes like twin lanterns piercing the fog of my hesitation. "This isn't about punishment. It's about unveiling your potential. You may not understand yet, but there is grace in obedience, beauty in discipline, and a freedom that comes from surrender." I nodded, even though my stomach tightened. The words sounded almost poetic, but the implication was clear. My normal world, the one where I could make mistakes and retreat, was no longer in play. "Now," she continued, "let's start with something simple. Clothes reflect the soul. She opened the wardrobe slowly, deliberately, revealing rows of garments. Delicate blouses, flowing skirts, soft satin slips, and lace-trimmed gloves. The textures seemed alive, whispering promises of elegance and transformation. I froze, uncertain where to look, overwhelmed by the sheer intimacy of the fabrics. She smiled, noting my hesitation. "You'll begin with a dress," she said, selecting a pale lavender piece, soft as clouds. "It's modest, yet expressive. Something that teaches you posture, poise, and attention." My hands trembled as I took the dress from her. The satin felt impossibly smooth, almost electric under my fingers. I wanted to turn away, to run back to the familiarity of my old room, but some deep, unnameable curiosity held me there. Aunt Vivian watched me silently, her gaze steady and knowing, as though she could see the thoughts swirling behind my eyes. Changing into the dress was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The fabric clung and flowed, shifting against my skin in ways that made me hyper-aware of every movement. My reflection in the mirror was almost unrecognizable. The boy I had been yesterday seemed distant, blurred at the edges. I fumbled with the zipper at the back, my hands awkward, and a blush rose unbidden to my cheeks. She stepped forward and guided me, her fingers brushing mine with gentle authority, correcting my stance, smoothing my shoulders. "See," she murmured, "grace isn't natural. It's learned, practiced, and cherished." I looked at myself again. The reflection was no longer merely a costume. It was a new possibility, frightening and exhilarating at once. My mind swirled with 1,000 conflicting feelings, shame at the unfamiliar curves and textures, wonder at the softness and flow, a cautious thrill at being molded under her watchful eyes. Aunt Vivian guided me to a chair, instructing me on posture, how to cross my legs with elegance, how to move my hands as if each gesture were music. My body resisted at first, stiff and clumsy, but gradually I felt a rhythm, a strange, fragile harmony with emotions. Each corrected step, each guided adjustment, left me simultaneously embarrassed and elated, as though I were discovering a secret part of myself that had always been waiting for permission to exist. Then came the gloves, delicate, lace-trimmed. Sliding them onto my hands, I marveled at how something so small could alter my perception, how tiny constraints could make movements feel deliberate and refined. "Every detail matters," she said, her tone unwavering. "Attention to the smallest things is what separates mere existence from artistry." Hours passed in a haze of guidance, reflection, and trembling discovery. My feet ached from learning to balance in unfamiliar shoes. My shoulders ached from posture drills, yet a strange satisfaction settled in my chest. The boy I had been yesterday was receding, and a new awareness, fragile and tender, was creeping forward, an identity that whispered promises of elegance, grace, and meticulous control. At one point, Aunt Vivian handed me a mirror, insisting I examine myself from every angle. The face staring back at me was the same, yet subtly altered, softened, almost luminous under the morning light. My heart fluttered with an emotion I couldn't name, vulnerability, curiosity, and an uneasy thrill mingling together. "You're more capable than you realize," she said softly. "But you must be patient. Transformation is not instant. It is cultivated, nurtured, and embraced." By the time I left that room, the sun was low in the sky. The world outside felt sharper, brighter, almost alien in comparison to the cocoon of lavender and lace I had just inhabited. I walked home slowly, every step measured, aware of the sway in my hips and the way the fabric brushed my skin. My reflection in the shop windows caught my eye, and I barely recognized myself. The boy I had been seemed a lifetime away, and yet a part of me clung stubbornly to that familiarity, whispering resistance and uncertainty. And I realized with a shiver that this was only the beginning. Aunt Vivian's lessons were not just about clothing, posture, or mannerisms. They were about unpeeling the layers of who I thought I was, revealing a self that existed somewhere between fear and wonder, hesitation and longing. I didn't know if I was ready, but some part of me, terrified, trembling, and oddly eager, knew I had no choice but to continue. The days that followed were a blur of sensations, discipline, and quiet revelations, each one layering over the last, until I began to feel like I was both unraveling and being stitched together in new, unfamiliar patterns. Aunt Vivian's house became a world unto itself, a place where time moved according to her rules, where every movement, every word, every thought was under subtle scrutiny. I arrived each morning with a mixture of dread and anticipation, never knowing exactly what she would demand, yet unable to resist the pull of her structured, exacting universe. She began to refine my mornings first. It was not enough to simply wear the garments. She insisted that I wake with intention, stretch with care, and approach each task with awareness. My reflection became a daily confrontation. She would watch as I brushed my hair, aligning each strand meticulously, correcting the tilt of my chin, the arch of my eyebrows. "The way you present yourself informs how the world perceives you," she would say, her tone both soft and inescapable, like a melody played just out of reach. "If you cannot control what is visible, you cannot control anything at all." I resented her, in moments, for how deeply she probed into the parts of me I thought were private. And yet, there was a strange magnetism in the way her guidance shaped me, a pull that made my resistance tremble and falter. When she had me practice walking through the house in heels, correcting the subtle misstep of my foot, or gesturing with my hands as if I were conducting an invisible symphony, a flutter of unfamiliar pride surged through me. I felt exposed, fragile, and yet there was an undeniable artistry in the transformation itself. The lessons were not just external. Aunt Vivian had a way of probing thoughts and feelings with questions that sounded innocent, almost casual, but that forced me to confront parts of myself I had buried. "Do you know why we dress the way we do?" she asked one evening, her eyes luminous in the soft lamplight. "It is not for others. It is to see ourselves in a way we cannot otherwise imagine. Who are you when no one is looking?" Her words struck something in me I could not yet name. I realized I was watching myself constantly, analyzing, judging, wondering if this emerging self, this poised, careful, elegant figure, was truly me or a version imposed by her hands, her vision. The conflict churned in my chest. Part of me longed to resist, to reclaim the boy I had been, while another part, quivering and curious, wanted to sink fully into the delicate folds of satin, the gentle pressure of lace, the deliberate gestures she had taught me. Some afternoons, she would introduce me to small tasks designed to reinforce the lessons. Arranging flowers, polishing silver, setting a table with painstaking attention to symmetry, mundane acts transformed into exercises in mindfulness and control. At first, I fumbled, my fingers clumsy, my mind restless. But slowly, step by step, repetition by repetition, I began to feel a rhythm, a harmony between my intentions and my actions. I discovered a quiet satisfaction in seeing order emerge from chaos, in knowing that each careful movement mattered. There were evenings when she would have me sit before the mirror for what felt like hours, applying subtle changes to my appearance, adjusting the curve of my lips, the arch of my eyebrows, the tilt of my chin. "Perfection is not natural," she whispered one night. "It is forged. And every day, you have the chance to forge yourself anew." I remember those nights vividly. The way the lamp cast shadows across my face, the way the fabrics smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood, the way my hands sometimes shook with effort, frustration, or longing. My reflection became a living challenge. Who was I beneath the satin and lace, beneath the posture and poise? And as I stared at the reflection, tracing every line, every subtle curve, I began to feel an unfamiliar tenderness toward this emerging self. A self that was not fully mine, yet no longer entirely foreign. The tension inside me deepened with each lesson. There were moments of panic, like the first time she asked me to speak softly, modulate my voice, elongate syllables with a deliberate gentleness. My own words felt foreign in my mouth, but the way she guided me through corrections, her hand on my shoulder, her gaze steady and unwavering, slowly untangled my fear. I began to hear myself differently, hear the echoes of a voice that could be soft yet commanding in its elegance. By the second week, the clothes themselves became less strange and more transformative. I started noticing the way light caught the folds of a skirt, the subtle sway in the fabric as I walked, the delicate weight of gloves shaping my gestures. I caught myself pausing mid-step to adjust a hem or smooth a sleeve, and instead of frustration, I felt an odd pride. Pride at mastering something that had once felt impossible, pride at the evidence of change in the mirror. Yet the internal struggle never left me. There were late nights when I would lie awake, wondering if this self I was learning to inhabit was truly mine, or if I was simply bending to Aunt Vivian's vision. I felt caught between resistance and surrender, between the familiar comfort of my old identity and the seductive, almost magical allure of this new persona. And in that tension, in that uneasy, trembling space between who I was and who I was becoming, something fragile and beautiful began to take root. By the third week, even simple movements, reaching for a cup, turning a page, brushing my hair, carried a new weight, a new intention. Every action was deliberate, every gesture mindful. My reflection no longer startled me. It was a companion, an echo of the transformation I could feel spreading quietly through my mind, my body, my very sense of self. The boy I had been was fading, not erased but refined, reshaped, folded into the emerging presence I carried in lace and satin, in posture and poise. And still, Aunt Vivian watched, always watching, her approval and critique an invisible thread that tied me to the lessons, to the growth, to the subtle, unrelenting push toward elegance. I had begun to understand, painfully and beautifully, that transformation was not a single moment. It was an accumulation of breaths, gestures, and choices. A slow, deliberate dance between fear and trust, hesitation and longing, the old self and the new. By the fourth week, the world outside Aunt Vivian's house had started to feel distant, almost unreal, like a faded photograph I could glimpse but never fully step into. Inside her walls, every corner, every surface, every sound had meaning. The ticking of clocks, the gentle hum of the radiator, the soft swish of skirts across polished floors, all of it became a backdrop to my constant, consuming transformation. I had begun to feel that the old version of myself existed only in memory, like a shadow I chased but could never catch. The mornings had grown ritualistic. I woke before dawn, the cool air brushing against my skin as I dressed meticulously in the clothes she had chosen for me. Satin, lace, delicate blouses, flowing skirts. They weren't just garments anymore. They were tools, extensions of a self that was emerging layer by layer. Each piece carried its own lesson, its own subtle instruction. Gloves reminded me of poise, shoes reminded me of balance, skirts reminded me to move with intention. Even the smallest detail, the angle of a collar, the curl of my hair, had significance. Aunt Vivian rarely raised her voice, yet her control was absolute. Every correction was precise, measured, delivered with a soft authority that made resistance feel futile. "Notice how the light falls on the fabric," she said one morning as I adjusted a skirt. "Notice how your reflection responds to your stance. Elegance is both internal and external. You must be aware of both." I found myself spending hours before mirrors, adjusting, practicing, perfecting, and observing. The reflection staring back was no longer frightening or alien. It was evolving, fluid yet coherent, a self I was learning to inhabit. And yet, within that emerging identity, the tension persisted, the pull between who I had been and who I was becoming. At night, when the house was silent and the soft rustle of curtains sounded like whispers, I sometimes pressed my hands to my face and wondered if I would ever fully reconcile the two selves. Aunt Vivian began introducing new exercises, more complex, more subtle, more psychologically intricate. She had me practice walking down the long hallway as if the walls themselves were watching, every step measured, every sway deliberate. She had me practice gestures as if communicating without words, each one intentional, precise, evocative. "Movement is language," she said softly. "It speaks before words ever reach the air." The emotional weight of these lessons was heavy. My mind was a constant storm of curiosity, fear, pride, and confusion. I sometimes caught myself lingering in front of mirrors for hours, tracing the lines of my face, the tilt of my neck, the fall of fabric over my shoulders. I began to feel the profound intimacy of self-awareness, an almost overwhelming consciousness of how every small detail shaped perception, identity, and intention. It was exhausting and exhilarating all at once. One afternoon, Aunt Vivian brought out a small set of jewelry, delicate chains, subtle earrings, tiny rings. "Adornment," she said, "is not vanity. It is awareness. It teaches you how to inhabit your form, how to carry attention gracefully." I hesitated, my fingers brushing the cool metal, feeling a jolt of both excitement and vulnerability. When she guided me to put on a pair of earrings, I noticed how the slightest movement of my head made them catch the light, how they framed my face differently, how the reflection in the mirror shifted from unfamiliar to recognizably me. The psychological transformation was deeper than the physical. I felt myself becoming aware of the subtle power in observation, in patience, in meticulous attention. I began noticing textures, the way lace whispered against skin, the way satin slid and swayed, the way light glimmered off polished surfaces. I started seeing the world through a lens of nuance, a slow, deliberate awareness that made every gesture, every glance, every breath an exercise in presence. Yet, for all this progress, doubt lingered. There were moments, usually late at night, when silence pressed against my ears and the world outside her walls seemed distant and unreachable, when I questioned if the self I was nurturing was truly me, or simply an echo of Aunt Vivian's vision. Sometimes I would lie awake, tracing the lines of my face in the dark, fingers trembling over my jaw, my lips, my collarbone, trying to understand what belonged to me and what had been shaped, guided, cultivated. Aunt Vivian never pressured me verbally during these times. Instead, she let the lessons, the discipline, and the gentle guidance speak for themselves. I learned patience, endurance, and subtlety, qualities I had never fully appreciated before. I began to understand that transformation wasn't a single act or a dramatic revelation. It was 1,000 tiny decisions, repeated carefully, deliberately, with awareness. Some evenings, she would have me sit before the mirror for hours, silently observing myself, refining, adjusting, practicing. And sometimes, when her gaze lingered on me with approval, I felt a warmth that was both comforting and unsettling. Approval from her was a currency, a weight that could lift or crush, and I found myself craving it while simultaneously fearing it. I realized I was learning to derive a sense of self-worth from the act of becoming, from the slow unfolding of a presence that was both new and mine. The culmination of these weeks was subtle, almost imperceptible. My posture became natural, deliberate, unforced. My gestures carried intention and rhythm. My voice had found a quiet elegance, a soft resonance that made each word deliberate yet effortless. I could see the change in the mirror without surprise or discomfort. The boy I had been was not gone, but folded into the emerging self, refined and integrated. I was learning to inhabit this new form, this new rhythm, this delicate, deliberate presence. And in that quiet, transformative space, I realized something profound. The lesson was never about clothes or gestures or even appearances. It was about learning to inhabit a self with awareness, grace, and intention. It was about surrendering to discipline, to guidance, and finding in that surrender not weakness, but a strange, unyielding strength. And slowly, imperceptibly, beautifully, I began to understand that this self, refined, elegant, poised, was becoming mine, not because it was forced upon me, but because I had learned to claim it, moment by delicate moment, gesture by careful gesture, reflection by patient reflection. By the 5th week, Aunt Vivian began to extend the lessons beyond the confines of her home, pushing me toward the fragile, trembling line where private transformation meets public perception. I had grown accustomed to the rituals inside her walls, the controlled environment where every step, every movement, every breath was guided and corrected. But the world outside was different, unpredictable, raw, and full of reflection in places I could not control. The first time she insisted I accompany her to the garden party of a distant cousin, my stomach had twisted in knots. She selected my outfit with care, a soft blush dress that flowed with every movement, delicate gloves, and a ribbon that held my hair back just so. "It's not about blending in," she said as she adjusted my posture in the mirror. "It's about presence. You must inhabit yourself fully, or the world will only perceive uncertainty." I walked through the streets with her, the crisp air brushing against my face, my hands trembling slightly as I clutched the folds of my dress. Each passerby's gaze felt like a ripple across the surface of my consciousness. I tried to carry myself as she had taught me, chest lifted, shoulders relaxed, hands poised, but the effort was exhausting. Every misstep, every nervous glance, felt magnified. I could feel the old boy I had been hiding somewhere deep inside, resisting, watching, questioning, and yet I pressed on, driven by some mixture of fear and longing. The garden party itself was a new kind of trial. People moved around with casual ease, laughter ringing out, glasses clinking, the scent of flowers and food mingling in the warm air. Aunt Vivian guided me through introductions, instructing me on tone, posture, the subtle nuances of attention. I found myself repeating the lessons I had drilled for weeks. The way I held my cup, the soft inclination of my head, the way my hands moved. Each correction she whispered to me was like a lifeline, a quiet tether that prevented me from falling into panic. And yet, the anxiety lingered. Each glance, each half-smile from strangers, sparked an internal battle. I felt like an actor inhabiting a role I had only begun to understand, my identity oscillating between boy and the emerging, delicate, poised self Aunt Vivian had shaped. But amidst the fear, I began noticing something unexpected, a sense of pride. Pride in mastering the smallest details, pride in inhabiting the lessons she had drilled into me, pride in feeling, even for a fleeting moment, like the presence I carried was wholly my own. Returning home, I could feel the weight of exhaustion settling into my bones, yet the exhilaration lingered. Aunt Vivian watched me closely, her eyes calm but penetrating. "Public perception is a reflection of inner discipline," she said softly. "You cannot control their thoughts, but you can control the clarity of your presence. That clarity is power." The following days were spent in reflection and reinforcement. Aunt Vivian introduced new rituals, writing, posture drills, observing shadows and light on the fabrics I wore. She made me practice reading aloud from poetry, adjusting tone, pacing, and inflection until my voice resonated with gentle authority. Every lesson was painstaking, deliberate, and designed to deepen awareness of self, to teach patience, precision, and quiet resilience. But the internal tension never fully dissipated. There were quiet moments, alone in my room, when I felt the weight of the transformation, the subtle tug between who I had been and who I was becoming. Sometimes I pressed my hands to my face, tracing the contours in the mirror, asking silently whether this new self, the one who moved with poise, spoke with intention, and carried herself delicately yet deliberately, was truly me. And each time, the reflection whispered back a tentative affirmation. Yes, this self could be yours, but only if you embrace the lessons, the discipline, and the careful awareness she had instilled. Aunt Vivian's guidance extended to the smallest gestures, the subtlest interactions. She taught me how to maintain elegance even in the midst of mistakes, how to recover from imbalance with grace, how to engage with the world without surrendering the careful control I had learned to cultivate. Each lesson built upon the last, weaving a complex tapestry of skill, awareness, and self-possession that left me simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. One afternoon, she placed me in front of the full-length mirror and instructed me to study myself from every angle. "This is not vanity," she said. "This is awareness. You must see yourself completely, Embrace every detail and understand how you inhabit your form. Only then can you truly carry yourself. I spent hours adjusting posture, smoothing fabric, aligning gestures, listening to her soft corrections, until the reflection staring back at me seemed to pulse with life. It was no longer just clothing or practice. It was presence, identity, awareness. The transformation was no longer just external. I felt it in the way I thought, the way I perceived the world, the way I measured my responses to even the smallest stimulus. I began noticing light and shadow, texture and tone, subtle rhythms in human interaction I had never considered before. Each day, I became more attuned, more deliberate, more fully inhabiting the self that was emerging through satin, lace, and guidance. Yet the tension remained. Some nights, lying awake, I felt a tremor of fear that this self I was nurturing might be temporary, fragile, or imposed. And yet, alongside that fear, a tentative excitement, the realization that I could inhabit a form I had never known, that I could feel power and fragility intertwined, and that the act of learning, of shaping, of surrendering and claiming simultaneously was slowly defining a self both new and deeply mine. By the end of the 5th week, I began to feel a quiet transformation not just in appearance or gesture, but in awareness itself. The lessons of posture, of poise, of patience and observation had settled deep within me. The boy I had been existed still, a subtle undercurrent, but the emerging self, the poised, attentive, aware, deliberate self, was becoming the dominant current. And in that delicate, trembling space between fear and understanding, I realized the journey was far from over. There were still lessons to learn, subtle refinements to make, and an entire world outside Aunt Vivian's guidance that would test everything I had begun to understand. By the 6th week, the lessons had begun to feel like second nature, yet the challenge was no longer merely about posture or clothing. It was about inhabiting the self in every moment, understanding the delicate balance between control and surrender, between the world's perception and my own inner truth. Aunt Vivian had begun pushing me into situations that demanded more than skill. They demanded authenticity, awareness, and courage. One morning, she asked me to accompany her to the local gallery, a place filled with strangers, light, and reflection. I was dressed in a soft, pale blue dress, gloves delicate and fitted, shoes that required every ounce of concentration to navigate gracefully. As we walked through the streets, my chest lifted, shoulders back, every movement measured, yet every step carried an underlying tension, the fear that I would falter, that the world would see the uncertainty behind the carefully cultivated exterior. At the gallery, surrounded by polished floors, glass, and paintings that captured emotion in frozen strokes, Aunt Vivian observed me closely. "You must inhabit the space, not just walk through it," she whispered. "Notice the light, the angles, the gaze of others. Move as though the world is an extension of your awareness." Her words sent a shiver through me. I felt exposed, yet electrified. Every glance from strangers felt amplified. Every subtle observation of my posture resonated through me. And yet, for the first time, I felt a strange confidence threading through the fear, a quiet acknowledgement that the self I had been learning to inhabit could exist beyond the mirrors and the lessons, could assert presence even amidst unpredictability. Back at her house, the reflection in the mirror seemed almost otherworldly. The face staring back at me was soft and deliberate, elegant and poised, yet threaded with the quiet tremors of vulnerability that reminded me I was still learning, still evolving. Aunt Vivian watched silently, her gaze a steady, unblinking assessment that made my skin prickle. "Tonight," she said softly, "we take another step. You will host dinner for me and 2 of my friends. You must orchestrate everything, from setting the table, to serving, to conversation, while maintaining grace, attention, and presence." My heart stuttered. Hosting, performing, maintaining perfection in social interaction, it was a trial I had never imagined. I spent the afternoon preparing, selecting napkins, arranging silver, adjusting the candles. Every detail was deliberate, rehearsed in my mind countless times. And yet, beneath the control, a flicker of fear lingered. What if I faltered? What if I revealed the boy beneath the poised exterior? The evening arrived, soft lamplight spilling over polished surfaces, the scent of flowers mingling with the faint aroma of food. Aunt Vivian's friends arrived, warm but curious, their eyes occasionally flicking toward me. I greeted them with the quiet elegance she had taught me, guided them to seats, poured wine with deliberate attention, and maintained posture, tone, and gaze with painstaking care. It was exhausting, my mind racing to monitor every gesture, every inflection, every microexpression, but amidst the effort, I felt a thrill unlike anything before. Here, in the midst of others' attention, I was not merely performing. I was inhabiting the lessons, living the transformation, feeling the self I had been nurturing finally asserting its presence. During the meal, Aunt Vivian observed me silently, correcting subtle movements with whispered instructions, guiding conversation with soft cues, and watching as I responded with a growing awareness of rhythm, tone, and timing. I felt the tension inside me stretch and reshape itself, becoming something unrecognizable yet undeniably mine, a poise born of practice, observation, and a delicate surrender to both guidance and self-awareness. Later, when the guests had left, I stood alone in the quiet of the house, exhausted and trembling, and looked at myself in the mirror. The reflection was no longer merely a combination of clothes and posture. It was a self fully inhabiting its form, aware, deliberate, present. The boy I had been lingered faintly beneath the surface, but he no longer dominated. He had folded into the emerging identity, a foundation rather than a limitation. Aunt Vivian approached, her eyes calm, a faint smile curving her lips. "You've come far," she said softly. "Not because I have pushed you, but because you have chosen to learn. You have discovered that surrender is not weakness, but awareness. That discipline is not confinement, but freedom. That presence is not performance, but understanding." Her words washed over me, a mixture of relief, pride, and quiet astonishment. For the first time, I felt the totality of the transformation, the intertwining of external elegance with internal awareness, the delicate dance between fear and courage, the emergence of a self that was deliberate, attentive, and undeniably mine. Yet even in that moment, I knew the journey was not complete. Transformation was not a destination. It was a process, a continuous refinement, a careful cultivation of presence, awareness, and grace. And I realized, with a mixture of wonder and humility, that I had crossed a threshold. The self I had feared would never feel natural was now a living, breathing presence, ready to navigate the world, refined yet delicate, deliberate yet alive, poised yet trembling with awareness. I pressed my hands to the mirror, tracing the soft lines of my face, the subtle sway of my hips, the curve of my shoulders. And in that act of reflection, I understood something profound. Identity is not merely inherited or discovered. It is cultivated, molded, and embraced, moment by deliberate moment, gesture by precise gesture. And through this delicate, unrelenting process, I had begun to claim a self that was no longer imposed upon me, but chosen, nurtured, and entirely my own. The 7th week began with a quiet morning, the kind that holds its breath as if waiting for revelation. I awoke with a strange mixture of anticipation and serenity, my body and mind attuned to the rhythm of deliberate practice that had become second nature. Satin slid smoothly over my skin, lace traced delicate patterns on my wrists, and every detail, the tilt of my chin, the sway of my shoulders, the cadence of my steps, felt like a language I had finally begun to speak fluently. Aunt Vivian appeared at the doorway, her expression calm yet luminous, as though she could see the subtle transformations that had taken root not only on my exterior, but deep within my consciousness. "Today," she said softly, "you no longer need instruction. Today, you inhabit your lessons fully. You are no longer learning merely through guidance. You are learning through awareness, presence, and choice." Her words settled over me like a gentle tide, washing away the last traces of uncertainty. I walked to the mirror and observed myself, not as a reflection to be corrected, but as a self to be recognized. The lines of my face had softened. The posture I carried was natural, fluid, confident. The boy I had been lingered faintly in memory, but he no longer pulled at me. He had become a quiet foundation, a point of reference rather than a source of conflict. The emerging self, refined, deliberate, poised, was now fully my own, claimed through weeks of discipline, observation, and conscious surrender. Aunt Vivian guided me to the parlor, where a small group had gathered, a few friends, neighbors, even distant relatives. The exercise was subtle but profound, to inhabit this new identity in the gaze of others, without overt instruction or reminder, simply presence. I moved through the space, conversing with measured tones, gestures precise yet effortless. Each interaction was both a test and a confirmation. The self I had been cultivating was real, coherent, undeniable. At one point, a friend complimented the way I carried myself, noting the grace in my gestures and the calm confidence in my voice. The words hit me like sunlight through fog, warm, illuminating, affirming. I realized then that the transformation was not merely visible in clothing, posture, or gesture, but in the subtle resonance of presence, the quiet authority of someone fully inhabiting their own being. Later, alone in the quiet of the house, I traced my reflection with gentle fingers, marveling at the tactile memory of satin, lace, and delicate fabrics that had accompanied me through this journey. I recognized in myself not only change but continuity. The lessons had not erased who I had been. They had refined, expanded, and integrated my awareness into a coherent whole. Fear, doubt, and resistance were still faint echoes, but they no longer dictated my identity. They were notes in a larger, richer harmony. Aunt Vivian approached, her eyes soft, her expression a quiet mix of pride and satisfaction. "You have learned to inhabit yourself," she said. "To move, to observe, to be present. To claim elegance not because it was imposed, but because you chose it. That is the essence of transformation. Not the shape of your clothes, but the shape of your awareness, your presence, your understanding." I nodded, a lump of emotion swelling in my chest. Weeks of discipline, tension, and reflection had led to this moment, a moment of fragile, shimmering clarity where I could finally say, I am both myself and the self I have nurtured. The external trappings of satin, lace, posture, and poise had become conduits, yes, but the true transformation was internal, emotional, psychological, and deeply personal. I walked slowly through the quiet house, feeling the weight and the lift of awareness in every step. Light caught the folds of my dress, brushed the curve of my shoulders, and danced across the soft contours of my face. The reflection in the mirror smiled back at me. Not a mask, not a costume, but a self fully recognized, fully claimed. And in that delicate, luminous realization, I understood that the journey was never truly about change imposed from outside. It was about cultivating attention, awareness, presence, and choice. About embracing guidance, surrendering to practice, and finding the balance between the self-remembered and the self-discovered. The process had refined me, shaped me, and ultimately allowed me to inhabit the person I had always carried within, waiting quietly, waiting for permission to step into the light. I pressed my hands lightly to the mirror, feeling the soft warmth of reflection and reality converging, and in that moment, I whispered, not to anyone, not aloud, but to myself, I am here. I am present. I am mine. And for the first time in weeks, perhaps for the first time ever, I felt complete.